driving accountability in the fight against corruption in Africa, jointly organized by the Data for Governance Alliance and the African Union Advisory Board Against Corruption. Today, we're here to discuss corruption and its impact on governance in Africa. This webinar is a precursor to the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption, which will be held on the 11th of July, 2023 in Arusha, Tanzania. This webinar will be a platform for experts, policymakers, and civil society actors to discuss corruption, trends, and reflect on the progress made in combating corruption in Africa. I am Shannon Pandey Kosa, and I will be your moderator today. Before we get into it, I would love to introduce our distinguished panel to you today. We have Honorable Edem Senanu from the African Union Advisory Board Against Corruption, Paul Mensah from the Data for Governance Alliance. We have Mame Ekwia Amwal-Tum from Afrobarometer, and Paul Banoba from Transparency International. We also have John Dea from Pan-African Lawyers Union, and Kojo Asante from CDD Ghana. During our marketing for this event, we were supposed to have Jagan Gray Johnson, but he unfortunately has some pressing events that he needs to attend to, but he would like to extend his apologies to everyone for not being able to make it today. In terms of some house rules for today's session, I'm sure you can see this is being recorded on YouTube right now and live streamed. If you would like to, please do retweet from your own personal platforms. We'd love to get as many viewers as possible. You can choose between the translation feature to hear translated audio in either English or French, so you'll be able to toggle at the bottom with your Zoom settings. Participants can use the Q&A feature to type in their questions. Our admin will then send me questions during our Q&A session at the end of this. I will select some of those questions and we will put them forward to our panel. And then our social media hashtags for this conversation is Africa Against Corruption. I'm going to repeat that, Africa Against Corruption. So please do get involved in the online conversation. We'd really like to hear what you have to say, what feedback you have as the speakers are sharing their insights with us. And then if you're looking for handles to tag, on Twitter, it's at Data for Governance Africa and at AUADC_, and the handles will be dropped into the chat. So this webinar is organized by the Data for Governance Alliance and the African Union Advisory Board Against Corruption. And we're going to get the ball rolling with welcome remarks from each of their representatives. But before I hand over to them, here's a little information on these two institutions and what they do. The African Union Advisory Board Against Corruption is an autonomous organ established within the African Union in terms of Article 22 of the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption. The African Union Advisory Board Against Corruption is conferred with a mandate to promote and encourage the adoption of measures and actions by state parties to prevent, detect, punish, and eradicate corruption and related offenses in Africa, as well as to follow up on the application of those measures. The advisory board is composed of 11 members, 2 members from each region, East, West, North, South, and Central Africa, and 1 slot that keeps rotating among the regions. The Data for Governance Alliance is a project aimed at promoting database advocacy and the engagement between Pan-African civil society organizations and members of the African Governance Platform. The consortium consists of 5 organizations, these being Afrobarometer, CDD Ghana, IDS at the University of Nairobi, the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, and Laws Africa, with funding from the European Union. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our speakers today. I'd like to call on Paul Mensah, who is the project coordinator for West Africa for Data for Governance, to give his opening remarks. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you and good morning to everyone. As Sharon has said, my name is Paul Nanakwabena Brampa Mensah. I'm the coordinator for Data for Governance Alliance in West Africa. So on behalf of the network members, Data for Governance Alliance is composed of 5 network members. The lead of the coalition is Afrobarometer, and IDS of Kenya, the Institute of Development Studies, We have the Institute of Justice and Reconciliation in South Africa, Laws Africa also in South Africa. We can make up the network members. Our focus as network is to use data to inform planning, policy uptake, and advocacy in Africa. It comes from a background that our work as civil society in Africa is mostly done without informed basis. So Data for Governance Alliance wants to fill this gap by coordinating with the Afrobarometer and work within the Afrobarometer enormous data accumulation to train some civil society organizations to support advocacy. And in doing that, we want to bridge also the communication and partnership gap between Pan-African CSOs and the African Governance Architecture members. So we have selected and working with 9 AGA platform members, including our partner we are holding this webinar with, the African Commission Advisory Board Against Corruption. We have the courts, we have the Child Commission, APRM, ECOSOC, and others. Since last year, we've started engagements and we had 3 separate trainings for our members in Eastern Africa held in Nairobi. We had a training in South Africa and we had one also in West Africa. Together, we built capacity of around 100 civil society members in Africa. This year, the Afrobarometer capacity building section has also started engaging some civil society organizations and the media. We've done one in Ghana for 20 civil society organizations and 20 media. They have started some in the Francophone countries and they are going to all the other regions. All this is to help build some capacities, support CSO for effective engagements with the African Governance Architecture members. We've also instituted quarterly webinar. We've had one with the APRM first quarter. We had one with the Office of the Youth Envoy in second quarter. And this is the third quarter one we are holding. And we plan to hold another one in the last quarter, probably with the commission. So in short, this is a brief of Data for Governance Alliance, and we encourage as many civil society organizations as possible to join some of these seminars and meetings so that we are able to bridge the gap between our civil society organizations and the AU. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Paul. Next, we're going to hand over to Honorable Edem Senanu, a member of the African Union Advisory Board Against Corruption, to give the welcome address. I must also note that I created some confusion in the program, as Honorable Edem Senanu will be going into a context setting piece after this. So please feel free to give your welcome address and take a pause in a moment, and I'll introduce your next section and then we can go into that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Shannon, and I hope you can hear me clearly. Distinguished participants and panelists, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed, good morning and welcome. On behalf of the chairperson of the African Union Advisory Board Against Corruption, Honorable Zainabo Diakité, and on behalf of the entire board, it is an absolute privilege for me this morning to welcome you to this CSO webinar, which is being co-hosted by the Data for Governance Alliance and the African Union Advisory Board Against Corruption. This webinar is a precursor to the 20th anniversary celebrations since the adoption of the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption. And it could not have come at a better time and with an apt topic. Our theme for today is CSO's contribution to driving accountability in the fight against corruption in Africa. And it aligns with the theme we have adopted as a board for our 20th anniversary activities, being the AUC-PCC 20 years after achievements and prospects, which inevitably would have required and does require us to scrutinize the efforts of CSOs in the fight against corruption. Critically, the various anti-corruption commitments, whether signed or ratified, are meant to be implemented, as that is the only thing that will make a difference in the fight against corruption. And to achieve this, these commitments would have to be translated into visible and tangible actions in our various member states. CSOs can and should be playing an important role in making this possible or happen. For instance, through demanding that the various provisions of the African Union Convention on the Prevention and Combat of Corruption is being domesticated and consequently implemented, and that the various provisions are actually, being felt within the various jurisdictions. Provisions such as the whistleblower protection mechanism, witness protection measures, access to information laws are all critical in ensuring an effective anti-corruption crusade. And these are some of the things that we expect to be domesticated and implemented. It will also entail ensuring that when these provisions, or for those places where it has been domesticated and is being rolled out, that this is being done effectively. We know that many member states have put in place dedicated anti-corruption agencies to enhance the fight against corruption. CSOs can further demand that these anti-corruption agencies are fully resourced to carry out their mandate effectively. Clearly, therefore, CSOs across the length and breadth of Africa can have far-reaching impact as they work to hold government officials in different member states to account on their anti-corruption commitments and hence drive accountability on the part of governments and other stakeholders. CSOs can also play another critical role by complementing government efforts in translating the commitments into tangible actions through outlining best practices on specific measures and actions, including key provisions of the AUCPCC, and also by forming and nurturing strong alliances. For example, what we have today with this webinar is an example of what can be achieved. Such alliances or partnerships are meant to strengthen anti-corruption measures and efforts, and hence drive accountability from all stakeholders, including the board itself as the premier anti-corruption organ on the continent. As we collectively continue to reflect on the critical contribution that CSOs play in driving accountability in the fight against corruption in Africa, I would like to emphasize that the board is a very willing partner to work together with other parties for better results, and welcomes, therefore, various partnerships in this regard. Our desire is to scale up these partnerships with different stakeholders, and therefore we are extremely grateful to the Data for Governance Alliance for having partnered with us to convene this webinar. I wish all of us insightful reflections, fruitful deliberations, and hopefully all of this will go a long way as we look to the next 20 years of the fight against corruption in Africa. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Honorable Senanu. As you prepare for your next section, I will just do a little bit of an introduction. So our next segment, we're going to be setting the scene, and Honorable Senanu will be telling us about the achievements and prospects of the AUCPCC 20 years since its adoption. If you are ready, Honorable Senanu, I'm going to hand back over to you. Thank you so much.
So thank you. And speaking on behalf of the board, looking at 20 years achievements and prospects. Let me start out by giving a little bit of context. So the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption was adopted at the second ordinary session of the Assembly on the 11th of July, 2003. As is the practice in the AU, 30 days after the 15th instrument of ratification was, as it were, deposited, the convention came into force. Consequently, on the 11th of July, that's in a few weeks, we'll be marking 20 years since the adoption. It is a framework that guides the member states in their fight against corruption and provides standards and guidelines on how state parties can fight corruption and promote good governance in their various jurisdictions. Some key elements of this convention include Article 13, that looks at the jurisdiction of the convention, Article 14, that looks at minimum guarantees of a fair trial, Article 15, that covers extradition. Article 16, that looks at the confiscation and seizure of proceeds and instrumentalities of corruption. Article 17 looks at bank secrecy. Article 18, cooperation and mutual legal assistance. And Article 19, international cooperation. Article 5 has legislative and institutional framework. Article 6 looks at the laundering of proceeds of corruption. Article 7, the need to declare assets. Article 8, issues of illicit enrichment. Article 9, access to information. Article 10, political party funding. Article 11 looks at private sector corruption issues. And Article 12 takes a look at civil society and media in the fight against corruption. Now, all the provisions of the convention are supposed to be implemented. So we have corruption being and its related offenses being criminalized under Article 4. And we expect that various member states would adopt legislative measures, including anti-corruption laws, anti-money laundering laws, subsidiary laws, all consistent with what you find in the convention. We also expect that member states will put in place institutional measures such as establishing, maintaining, and strengthening the independence of anti-corruption agencies, creating, maintaining, and strengthening internal accounting and relevant systems. We expect member states to put in place preventive measures such as encouraging citizens' confidence in the fight against corruption, punishing those who knowingly make false reports, protecting whistleblowers and informants, promoting public awareness and education, creating a good environment for the participation of CSOs and media in the fight against corruption. We also expect that state parties will cooperate with others in relation to the confiscation of the proceeds of corruption, in respect of mutual legal assistance, in respect of international cooperation, and in respect of bank secrecy. So what are some of the strides and milestones that we can talk about from the level of the board? So some of the things that we have done and mechanisms in place include the country reviews that the board conducts, where we visit and we try and assess what is going on in each country. In advance, we would give you a standard form. The country would review and will come in and do a validation and draw conclusions. We also have the African Anti-Corruption Day, 11th July, which is coming up, and various member states will be running activities to bring a focus on the issues relating to the fight against corruption. We also have the African Anti-Corruption Year, which was celebrated in 2018, and the Nouakchott Declaration. We've institutionalized the annual African Anti-Corruption Day as a way of making sure there is attention paid to this issue. We have the Non-State Actors Forum. We are working on the Common African Position on Asset Recovery. Various thematic research has been done relating to the fight against corruption. And we have been working, building partnerships to, as it were, promote the fight against corruption. In terms of ratification, to date, 49 of the 55 EU member states have signed the convention, whilst 48 member states have ratified the convention and are therefore parties to it and are expected to be implementing fully the provisions of the AUCPCC. The seven countries that have not yet ratified include Cape Verde, Djibouti, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Eswatini, Somalia, and South Sudan. And we are working together with the governments. We've been writing and following up, hoping to encourage them also to come online. What are some of the achievements at member states level? Many of the state parties have criminalized corruption and therefore have laws in that respect and have created various offenses that enable us to determine when people have offended and have been corrupt and therefore can be sanctioned. Many of the states have also recognized challenges with the legal frameworks, and then therefore commence reforms to strengthen their anti-corruption laws. Member states have also put in place institutions to promote the fight against corruption. And so we have several anti-corruption agencies, financial intelligence units, asset recovery agencies, anti-corruption law enforcement agencies in various member states. Also, to foster the fight against corruption, many of the national anti-corruption authorities have established anti-corruption strategies and plans which are being implemented. The member states have also established multi-sectoral frameworks to spearhead the conduct of nationwide anti-corruption education, sensitization, and awareness creation in order to effect attitudinal change among citizens with regard to the fight against corruption. Member states have also put in place legal frameworks such as anti-corruption acts, whistleblowers acts, witness protection acts, the Proceeds of Crime and Anti-Money Laundering Act, the Prevention of Organized Crimes Act, Mutual Legal Assistance Act, Public Financial Management Acts, Leadership and Integrity Acts and Codes of Conduct, Public Service Acts, Public Procurement and Asset Disposal Acts, Public Audit Acts, Access to Information Acts, Bribery Acts, Criminal Procedure Codes, and Extradition Acts. So these are some of the legal frameworks that have helped us across the continent in promoting this fight against corruption. What are some of the challenges we have documented in respect of the effective implementation of the AUCPCC? Inadequate human and financial capacity within various national anti-corruption authorities, the lack of an impartial implementation of the AUCPCC, non-ratification of the AUCPCC by member states, outdated anti-corruption legal frameworks, lengthy delays in concluding cases that are within the court system, increasing impunity and grand corruption in many member states, and a lack of political will to act on the convention and its provisions. Looking forward, what are the prospects that we see over the next 2 decades? We believe that with evidence-based research on anti-corruption, strategies to fight corruption can be made much more effective. The current legal reforms in many African countries can also contribute in this fight and strengthening the work that is being done. With the continuous and heavy investments in educational and awareness raising campaigns, we are hoping that the youth will be galvanized and mobilized to also contribute. And as we know, statistically, they are the most important demographic in our continent. With the regional economic community's role in promoting the fight against corruption and the implementation of the convention, we're expecting more synergies and collaboration that can contribute to reducing and minimizing corruption on the continent. Also, the emergence of strong partnerships between regional and national anti-corruption organizations, African civil society, NGOs, academia, media, the fight against corruption is definitely being strengthened. What are some of our recommendations? There's a need to empower various anti-corruption agencies and bodies to ensure that their power is protected by the highest laws of the land and the political elite. There's need for strong partnerships between anti-corruption stakeholders, partnerships between regional and national anti-corruption organizations, civil society, NGOs, international bodies, and much more in order to make more gains. There's a need to strengthen peer learning amongst anti-corruption agencies for experience sharing and knowledge exchange. There's a need for non-state actors to continue advocacy efforts towards ensuring that the outstanding member states can ratify and go beyond that to implement the convention. There's also a need for our various member states to undertake regular systematic reviews to identify legal and institutional impediments that are working against the fight against corruption. There's a need for much more technical assistance, and there's a need for evidence-based strategy and policy making And that means that we need to do more targeted research to get this done. On that note, I want to say thank you, and you can connect with us with the details that have just been projected. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Honorable Sinanu, for providing context and outlining the achievements and prospects of the AUC PCC. We really appreciate your input and insights. For our next segment, we're going to be moving on to presentations on CSO's contribution to the implementation of the AUC PCC and the promotion of the fight against corruption. Our first speaker is Don Dare. By means of a quick introduction, Don is an advocate of the High Court of Kenya and the CEO of the Pan-African Lawyers Union. Among other things, he chairs the executive committees of the Pan-African Citizens Network, the Stop the Bleeding Consortium, and the International Coalition on the Responsibility to Protect. He's a steering committee member of the African Court Coalition, and he's a prolific litigator in various African international courts and tribunals. Thank you so much for joining us, Don. I'm going to hand over to you now.
Okay, thank you very much, Shannon, and good morning or good afternoon or evening, depending on where you're joining us from, to all our participants. It's a public holiday here in Tanzania, probably in other parts of Africa as well. So it's quite a feat that we have 71 participants apart from the panelists and the organizers. It's not an easy feat to achieve at this point in time. I also give the apology of my colleague, Jagan Gray Johnson, with whom was supposed to be on the panel, but had some issues, so he couldn't join. I wanted to just make some few remarks because I prefer more, an interactive debate rather than a lecture. We tend in such forums to be preaching to the converted. So it is better that, we just have a discussion on what can practically be done rather than long theories. But I just wanted to reflect on a number of things. When Edem was speaking, one thing that is sometimes forgotten is the amount of will that we had 20 years ago around this continent. The AU Anti-Corruption Convention that Edem spoke about was ratified in 3 years. It was adopted on 11th July 2003, as Edem showed us. And by 5th August 2006, it had achieved 15 ratifications and came into force. That was one of the fastest when it comes to AU legal instruments. It usually takes about double that time to get the first 15 states to ratify. So there was quite a bit of will then, and quite a bit of, there was an air around the continent then, which seems to be lacking now, at least in terms of parts of our political and bureaucratic leadership. And I think part of our challenge as citizens is to see how to generate that kind of momentum again, that kind of strong commitment to actually go beyond rhetoric and to getting things to change. Next, in reflecting on what civil society has done in the context of combating corruption on the continent, I'd just like to point out again that civil society exists at various levels. It exists at the community level, community-based organizations and movements, some registered, some not. It exists at the national level, many registered as NGOs, but others registered as trusts, as companies limited by guarantees, or even unregistered as social movements. It exists at the regional level because now we've seen over the last 20 years across the entire continent, lots of NGOs or lots of civil society, broadly put, that have constituted themselves to work in the regional level, which the UN calls a sub-regional level. So in West Africa, in East Africa, in Central Africa, North Africa, and so on. And sometimes in regional formations that transcend this, like we've got COMESA, the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, and a CSO constellation around that. And then there are those like PALU and others that work predominantly at the continental level. And of course, we've got colleagues that work at the international level, including with a focus on Africa. So civil society is diverse and it works on diverse planes. And sometimes it works together and sometimes it doesn't. And one of our biggest recommendations is continuous stakeholder mapping, even amongst ourselves as civil society, so we know who's doing what and who we can work with, because there's a lot of work to be done and there are not that many workers. Now, reflecting for a second on the kind of things that civil society have done in the context of combating corruption, again, it runs the whole gamut. Awareness raising on the ills of corruption, on the existence of corruption, and on some of the tools of fighting corruption, the laws, policies, strategies, and institutions. They've also engaged in capacity building, building their own capacity, building capacity of communities to speak out for themselves, and building capacity of our governmental agencies, because as Honorable Adam has pointed out, in many instances, at the national level, at the continental level, and so on, there is a shortage of capacity, especially of human capacity. So for instance, Adam has spoken about the work that AUABC has managed to do in the last 18 or so years when it's been practically on its feet. And what is often forgotten by people is that apart from the 11 directly elected members who serve on a part-time basis, the Secretariat of the AUABC, which is supposed to run the affairs in 55 countries simultaneously on a full-time basis, has less than 6 permanent members of staff. And it has a very small budget. So sometimes when we even engage with colleagues and you can see the high aspirations that they have for the AUABC and the role it could play, I just sometimes tell them, please go and see what the policymakers in Addis have confirmed as the structure of the Secretariat, how many permanent positions they have created, and what kind of budget that they've given. So many times civil society find itself having to pitch in to help in capacity building, continental level, sub-regional level, national level, just because of these budgetary constraints, human resource constraints, and sometimes because of the complexity of the work we're doing, also technical constraints. And civil society has engaged in the law and policy making cycle, engaging when laws and policies and strategies are being formulated at the national level, at the regional level, and at the continental level, and even at the UN level in terms of ANCAC and UNODC. We've seen very active civil society engagement. They've also engaged in investigation of actual instances of corruption, both including investigative journalism, but even just anti-corruption NGOs that try and investigate what are the trends. Is it procurement fraud? Is it nepotism? Is it bribery? Is it illicit financial flows, for instance, which is now one of the biggest issues that we're dealing with? So investigation has been one of the fortes of various kinds of civil society. And then reporting on what they're investigating and what they're finding. So again, we've seen civil society engaging in reporting in corruption, in terms of reporting in the media, through press conferences, through op-eds, through articles, through exposés, but also treaty reporting in terms of preparing complementary reports when the states, as parties to various anti-corruption conventions, are doing their reports. Civil society has also engaged in advocacy and campaigning around anti-corruption issues, around building a movement that fights corruption, but also around specific corrupt incidences in our countries or lately in our regions, because part of what we are suffering is also institutional corruption, unfortunately, including in some of our own institutions of the African Union in terms of the various organs, institutions, and specialized agencies of the AU. So whistleblowing has been a big role that civil society have played. Civil society have also used litigation as a strategy, both monitoring, trial monitoring, when governments are actually investigating and prosecuting, so they monitor the trials, or engaging in private criminal prosecutions. And again, I keep on urging that we don't do enough of that, because again, as Honorable Adam has said, sometimes it's just the lack of the will beyond the rhetoric to do something. And of course, corruption is a thing where both the giver and the taker are guilty. So it will not be easy for them to be the ones to call themselves out. And many times it's a crime committed by the most powerful in our society, powerful politicians, powerful bureaucrats, or powerful business people. So sometimes the investigative and prosecutorial agencies are not going to move quickly. And in certain instances, civil society has learned how to do that. And again, we've engaged in litigation within our countries, but even using universal jurisdiction laws litigation in other countries, including in partnership with colleagues in Europe, in various European countries, which is sometimes where assets stolen from African countries are parked. But we've also engaged in a whole range of civil litigation, access to information requests, ethical courts and tribunals under the ethical codes, going after unjust enrichment, and so on. So those are some of the things that we've done. Obviously, we've also engaged in advocacy, and we keep on calling for advocacy. One, for instance, advocacy for universal ratification of the AU Anti-Corruption Convention. As Edem has pointed out, we have only 48 ratifications. There are 7 to go. And also for us, we've been calling for ratification of the Malabo Protocol. That is a protocol that would eventually add an international criminal jurisdiction to the existing African Court on Human and People's Rights. And we call so because in the African system, unlike the ICC, which only criminalized genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and potentially in the future, the crime of aggression, in the African legal instrument, these 4 were added, but we also put a crime of corruption, a crime of money laundering, a crime of illicit exploitation of natural resources. And then the Malabo Protocol provides for individual criminal liability, as for instance, does the Rome Statute system. But it also provides for corporate criminal liability. So you can go after the individuals, but you can also go after the companies. And we do know that in our continent, a big part of our grand corruption is around natural resources extraction, oil, gas, minerals, rare earth, and so on. And it involves very big multinational corporations. So the ability of states and the ability of citizens to go after not just the individuals, but also the corporations, be they African multinational corporations, Western multinational corporations, or Eastern multinational corporations, would be a game changer. So for us, it's something that we've been calling for very, very broadly. For example, now, and that's the last thing that I'll say, starting May last year, we learned of the, of the scandal surrounding Glencore, a big multinational corporation with its origin in Switzerland, where Glencore was caught bribing, serious bribery of public officials and other politically exposed persons in 6 African countries: Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, Democratic Republic of Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Nigeria, and South Sudan. And it was huge, huge bribery. Now, the American government investigated as part of their Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and they filed a case against Glencore. And Glencore did a plea bargain with the American government and paid millions of dollars in fines to the American government. And then the UK government also began a prosecution. And again, Glencore did a plea bargain and again paid off millions of dollars in fines to the UK government. But the 6 African victim countries have not received anything. So it is our resources that were stolen through this bribery. It is we who are suffering the brunt, but we have not yet been able to get enough information to investigate and prosecute. So having something like the Malabo Protocol means we will not have to do 6 individual prosecutions and investigations. We could actually pool all our resources together and do 1 investigation and 1 prosecution for the 6 countries. So maybe that's a good place to stop. And thank you for your patience, Shannon.
Thank you so much for your insightful reflections, Don, on the role that civil society has played in fighting corruption on the continent. Very much appreciated. We're going to head over to our next speaker, Mr. Paul Bonoba. Paul is a governance and accountability professional working with Transparency International as Africa advisor. He has spent the last few years engaged with interventions on corruption in Africa, civil society capacity, and media development for accountability. His current work includes a focused engagement on accountability for Africa's anti-corruption commitments. Thank you so much for joining us, Paul. I'm going to hand over to you.
Many, many thanks, Shannon, and a good morning, everybody. And it's a really great privilege and honor to be part of this conversation at this time, especially with regard to the context of the 20th anniversary of this convention that brings us all our work together. I am with Transparency International, and I'll say a little about that we think of ourselves as a global coalition fighting against corruption. And we are currently spread across or present in 120 countries around the world, having started in 1993. And in that respect, in 2023, we are marking or celebrating our 30th anniversary as an organization. So it ties in with a number of other marks that we are marking collectively as an anti-corruption community, especially for the African context, the adoption of the AUCPCC. And in Africa, we are present in 28 countries across all the economic blocks, North, West, East, Central, and Southern Africa. And we have a forum where we come together as the chapters, that's the name that we give ourselves at country level, in the African context. And every year that we come together, we put forth some reflections on what has happened the previous year and what ought to happen in the coming years. And we've been doing this since the beginning. We notably are known for putting forth in this forum that I'm talking about, the Nyanga Declaration from Zimbabwe, that called for quite a number of matters that we're now looking into with regard to anti-corruption in the banking sector, in international transactions, and that is as far back as 2001. And at the time that we started, we did not have a centralized interlocutor to have this conversation with. So it is a great, great stride that looking back over the years, so much has been done, so much has come into place, including now the AUCPCC and the AUABC. And in terms of the collaboration that we have, let me speak a little bit like Don. Let me actually add a few reflections to my brother Don, because I think I agree that that is a practical way to have these conversations. So in terms of the work of the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption, the CPCC, civil society was involved in the strides that Don is mentioning to help with the discussions at country level leading to the ratifications to bring the convention into force in the time that it came into force in 3 years. And that is actually also a contribution from the civil society side, working in collaboration with state actors who have the responsibility to make this happen. And that is as far back as the early days. And since then, there's also been support to then implement the convention, because it's quite ambitious, calls into place a number of things. But I think let me just point out a few that in terms of the space availed to civil society, we struggle a lot in a number of accountability areas, in other themes. In terms of the space availed for anti-corruption by the African Union in this convention, there is no challenge. That space exists. In the space in itself is articulated first in Article 12, which Honorable Edem mentioned, under civil society and media, and calls into place all states parties to this convention, all the countries that have ratified, to take particular steps to involve civil society in particularly spelled out areas. And that is the space. To be a bit more specific, the convention calls on the states parties, the countries, to involve civil society in the monitoring of the implementation of the convention. And that's provided for, and one can make reference to it where they believe it's not happening, and we've done so. And a bit more specifically again, the same article, Article 12.4, calls on the states to provide space to media actors. If there is a case in court and that case relates to corruption, the state is called upon to make media, give access to media to that case. So these are types of the spaces. Article 22, which puts in place the African Union Board against corruption, specifically also calls on the board to work with non-government organizations, among other partners, And the board has so generously done so and called upon civil society to engage, to work with the board, to participate in the activities of the board. And that is the space. So in that respect, there is no struggle, and there is no, one cannot say, like we say elsewhere, that we are challenged, there's shrinking space, or we do not have access. And therefore, with that space available, some of the limitations have been capacity limitations, as have been mentioned. And if we do manage to get over some of these capacity hurdles, the next 20 years could achieve quite more. One aspect that would, in our view, be a bit transformative is on data. So it's quite appropriate that in this section, I mention it here. There is already some available data by way of research done by civil society organizations. And it might be valuable to find ways of collecting this data and presenting it to these spaces that have been availed, and then also bring in some coordination and being aware of what is going on in all these spaces, in the courts. And we have tried to some respect, I would say, and I will also end with this in a few minutes, that we are working towards a social movement, but perhaps this social movement is not yet loud enough on this issue of anti-corruption. But we are working towards a social movement. And as a social movement, if we could collect all our different actions in some sort of coordinated way and enable those who can take action on them to see them clearly, there is some merit to be given to what could come out of that. That is not yet happening at the scale at which we would expect it. One of the reports we put together is the assessment of the implementation of this convention, the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption. We had the opportunity when the African Union designated 2018 as the African Anti-Corruption Year. We had the opportunity to work with the partners who are all coming together to celebrate this year and to take on board a number of activities in this year under the aegis of the then multi-stakeholder working group on corruption, of which many of us have been part. My brother Don, my brother Jegan, who's not here. And we managed to collect some information and put it before the board. From the Transparency International side, the exercise that we did to assess 4 articles of the convention and the state of the implementation also exposed that there are quite some difficulties in accessing data on how we are doing. If you wanted to know how many cases have been prosecuted on anti-money laundering in the jurisdictions that have ratified this convention, you would struggle, because we did struggle to find this information. Some countries are doing better than others, but it's good to put it out and see, this is how far we've gone. This is so-and-so is doing better than they were doing last year. Maybe they've made some progress, have lessons. Can we visit? Can we learn? So that data is not yet together. It's not, and it would give us great strides if it came together. We have, and I'll end with this, we have the opportunity also during the country visits as civil society, when the African Union conducts the missions that Honorable Edem has talked about. The conversation is not only with the state, the conversation is also with civil society, and that is a coordinated conversation. It's another space that one could take advantage of and make more meaning from. So in the next 20 years, if I were to look forward into the future, be a bit of a clairvoyant, I would say that if data came together and civil society also organized to utilize the already existing spaces, and the ones which are opening up, there are some which are opening up by default. There are some which have already been opened by the convention. There are some which are forced to open, say if we did some crowd type of approach, crowd data collection, as some colleagues have proposed on wealth declarations, which we have across the entire continent. If Paul, who is coming into office, makes a declaration, my community should be able to see what I've declared. And my community can also validate whether what I'm saying is correct or not in those declarations. So those types of conversations bring together many actors, putting information in the same space, visible to everybody else. We would make some strides. That's where we look at in the next 20 years. And perhaps we can have some more reflection around that. I thank you so much, Shannon. I think it's a good place to stop and back to you.
Paul, thank you so much for providing context on the work of Transparency International within the anti-corruption community and providing tangible next steps for the continent. Your emphasis on the use of data in the fight against corruption really underscores the importance of this partnership between the AU, ABC, and the Data for Governance Alliance, and also provides the perfect segue into our next speaker's section. So I'd like to invite Mame Ekua Amotum to present Afrobarometer data on Africans' views on corruption. And a quick introduction for Mame. She is Afrobarometer's communications coordinator for Anglophone West and North Africa, based at CDD Ghana. In her capacity, she oversees Afrobarometer's communication activities in Ghana, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Gambia, Liberia, Tunisia, Algeria, Cabo Verde, and Sao Tome and Principe. She has authored extensively on various themes, including corruption. Mame, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Shannon. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. Like Shannon said, my name is Mame Ekua, and I work at CDD Ghana as the Anglophone Comms Coordinator on the Afrobarometer project. And today I'm very excited to share the Afrobarometer findings on what Africans' views are on corruption. But before I go into the findings, I'd like to give us a brief introduction about Afrobarometer. So Afrobarometer is a Pan-African survey research organization that provides reliable data on the experiences and aspirations of African citizens regarding democracy, governance, and quality of life, and also including topics like corruption, which we are discussing today. Our goal is to give African publics a voice in policy and decision-making. As a network, we've conducted 8 rounds of surveys since 1999 in up to 39 African countries. And currently, we are closing the chapter on round 9 surveys and preparing for round 10. If you look at the next slides, these are some of the countries that we'll be working in, and the gray areas are the countries we are yet to conduct survey in. I'd like to quickly touch on our methodology. So we use a nationally representative sample of adult citizens in our surveys. And so this means that our respondents are 18 years and above. We also conduct our interviews face-to-face, and most importantly, in the language of the respondent's choice. We also use a standard questionnaire across our countries, and this allows us to do comparisons of our responses across these countries and also do overtime analysis. Our sample sizes are between 1,002 to 1,004, and this yields country-level results with margins of sampling error plus or minus to plus or minus 2 to plus or minus 3 percentage points. And so with that, let's go into our findings. So, just a sec. So on average, across 36 African countries surveyed in 2021, 2022, almost 6 in 10 Africans, and that's 58%, say that corruption increased in their country during the previous year, including 46% who say it increased a lot. And then we have 1 in 5, and that's 19%, who believe that corruption at least decreased somewhat, while 20% say it stayed at the same level. On the next slide, we see that perceptions of increased corruption levels are most widespread in countries like Eswatini at 87%, South Africa at 82%, Lesotho at 81%, and Sudan at 80%. But on the other side, we see that only 1 in 8 Bedouins, and that's 13%, say corruption increased, while 70% say it's decreased. Now, on our next slide, we see that since 2014, 2015, the situation has worsened significantly in 12 of the 30 countries surveyed in both 2014, 2015, and 2021, 2022. Now, perceptions of increasing corruption have risen most dramatically in the following countries. We have Senegal, where perceptions of increasing corruption has risen by 39 percentage points, and that's from 34% to 73%. Followed by Burkina Faso, where perceptions of increasing corruption has risen by 29 points. Then we have Gabon by 24 points, Cameroon by 23 points, and Cote d'Ivoire by 22 points. But in Benin, we see that the proportion who reports that corruption is increasing has dropped by 61 percentage points. Again, we see drastic declines being recorded in countries like Zambia, and this is by 36 points, Tanzania by 27 points, Lesotho by 24 points, and Sierra Leone by 19 points. So this leads us to our next slide. Who is corrupt in Africa? Now we see that among key public institutions, the police are most widely seen as corrupt. On average, almost half of Africans say most or all police officials are involved in corruption, in addition to 41% who see some of them as corrupt. Now, again, we see that more than 1/3 of citizens see corruption among most or all members of parliament. They see corruption in most or all tax officials, civil servants, presidency officials, and judges and magistrates at 35%. Now, let's zoom in a bit to the police. Here we see that in 14 of the 36 countries, half or more of the adult population believe that most or all police officials are corrupt. And we see that perceived corruption among the police is highest in Uganda at 75%, Nigeria at 73%, and Sierra Leone at 72%. Now, on our next slide, we see that on average, across 30 countries consistently interviewed between 2014, 2015, and 2021, 2022, perceptions of institutional corruption have remained unchanged for the police. And you can see that it's only moved from 47% to 48%. We see the same, that perceptions of corruption have remained unchanged for MPs, for civil servants, and judges and magistrates. But we do find that the proportions of citizens who see most or all officials as corrupt increased by 7 percentage points for the office of the president or prime minister. Now let's look at Africans' experience when it comes to bribery. On average, across 36 countries, more than 1/3 of citizens who dealt with the police during the previous year say they had to pay a bribe. And so this is 37% of those who sought police assistance and 35% of those who encountered the police in other situations, such as a traffic stop or investigation. Now, again, we see that the same is true for 3 in 10 citizens who tried to obtain a government document, and 1 in 5 who went for medical care, that's 20%, or requested assistance at a public school, and that's 19%. So that leads us to the question, how do Africans rate their government performance in fighting corruption? From this slide, we see that about 2/3 of Africans say their government is doing a fairly bad, that's 27%, or very bad, that's 40%, job of fighting official corruption. And only 3 in 10, that's 30%, approve of their government's performance. Still on government performance, our findings show that only in 6 countries do more than half of citizens approve of their government's anti-corruption efforts. And these countries are Benin at 77%, Tanzania at 65%, Zambia at 61%, Mali at 59%, Sierra Leone at 58%, and Guinea at 52%. Now, we also see that fewer than 1 in 5 citizens in Sudan, Gabon, Eswatini, South Africa, Liberia, Gambia, Lesotho, Ghana, Uganda, and Nigeria approve of their government's anti-graft efforts. And on the next slide, we see that with overtime, we see on average across 29 countries surveyed in both 2014, 2015, and 2021, 2022, positive assessments of the government's handling of corruption have not changed. But when you come to the country level, approval ratings have soared in Benin, and this is by 58 percentage points. It has soared in Sierra Leone by 39 points, in Zambia by 29 points, and Tanzania by 28 points. But on the other hand, 17 countries record declines in approval ratings, including huge drops in Eswatini, and this by 38 points, in Lesotho, in Botswana, in Senegal, and Burkina Faso by 22 points. So, how do Africans feel about reporting corruption in their countries? And this brings me to the final part of my presentation. On our slide, we see that 7 in 10 Africans, and that's 71%, say that ordinary citizens risk retaliation or other negative consequences if they report corruption to the authorities. And it's only 1 in 4, and that's 20%, 26%, who believe that they can speak up without fear. When you zoom in, you see that around 9 out of 10 citizens fear retaliation in Gabon, in Nigeria, and in Eswatini. But when you take Mauritania and Morocco, they are the only countries where fewer than half of citizens share this view. And this brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much, Shannon. Over to you.
Mame, thank you for grounding the insights shared by panelists in data from African citizens. And I'd just like to remind everyone on this webinar and who's watching online that Afrobarometer data is open and available to anyone. You just need to head over to afrobarometer.org to explore data on perceptions of corruption and many other topics. I would love to introduce our next panelist. I'm going to invite Kojo Asante to present on working to expose corruption, practitioners' experiences. And to introduce Kojo, he is the Director of Advocacy and Policy Engagement at CDD Ghana. For the last 18 years as a legal policy and governance specialist, Kojo has worked and led advocacy on a diverse range of issues, including anti-corruption, social accountability, local government, human rights, natural resource governance, and the politics of development. He's going to share with us insights from some CDD Ghana anti-corruption initiatives, notable among which is Corruption Watch. Kojo, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Shannon. And thanks for the Data for Governance Alliance and the AU Board Against Anti-Corruption for inviting me to, this very important discussion. I think that sometimes we complain that corruption, we talk too much about corruption, but I think that if we don't keep talking about corruption, then corruption would completely eat us all and destroy our development and our democracy. I'm trying to share my slides here. Let's see. Good. All right. So I think I wanted to do just a quick case study, maybe just to give everybody a sense of what civil society has been doing and the different ways in which we are trying to contribute to the fight against corruption. This is a presentation on Corruption Watch, an initiative that we started with Joy FM, or the multimedia group, a media station in Ghana. And I'm going to talk about the approach to this initiative, some of the achievements and the lessons learned from it. So CDD Ghana, our mission is to deepen democratic consolidation, good governance, and inclusive development. And one of the key areas that we look at is economic and corporate governance, which anti-corruption is a component of it. In 2017, we initiated this anti-corruption initiative with the media so that we can combine our skills and experience with civil society bringing research analysis and the media also providing the platform and the communication skills to reduce corruption in the public space. The assumption was that we thought that a lot of corruption cases that were being uncovered by investigative journalists primarily and other whistleblowers were not being followed through. And this was to do with also the media cycle, which tends to take up an issue, and then within a week, we have another issue, and then everybody forgets about it. And if you want to tackle corruption, you have to have a very long commitment to bring in these cases to a conclusion. So I think as Mami has presented, you can see that Ghana is not doing quite well at all when it comes to the fight against corruption. And you can look at almost like a 10-year trend and see that really the challenge is being more of stagnation, in some cases deterioration, at least from the Afrobarometer perception surveys. Now, the approach to Corruption Watch was five, we call them the 5 Ps, that we wanted like a 360 process where we were persistent in trying to expose corruption, but that once the corruption was exposed, there was investigation and there was punishment. But most importantly, also that we were recovering the assets or the illicit enrichment that has taken place. And that means the people pay back when they were caught. And then we were also thinking about policy. How do we tighten the structures so that what was the advantage that was taken off was not repeated in another case. But more importantly, how do we prevent corruption? So these were always our guiding principles with Corruption Watch. And it was a radio show, so you have different components, but a key part of it is a radio show that is broadcasted on Joy FM, both their English language radio station and their local language radio station every other week. And you have about 6 segments which are discussed. So sometimes it's a new corruption case. Sometimes you are just sharing best practices. Sometimes you just want to educate, and sometimes you do a total recall where you know that a case is not being followed through. And in the good moments, we're able to run about 40 shows in a year. Now, let me talk about some of the key achievements. Corruption Watch independently, over the period, independently uncovered about 70 corruption cases. About 90 or so radio stations and radio shows have been broadcasted with the main objective of just keeping everybody on their toes regarding the incidents of corruption. Some of the exposés that were done, one involved the illegal sale of blood by staff of a blood bank in major hospitals. And this led to a big, investigation, basically exposing blood contractors in these hospitals and the confiscation of fridges and things that they were using in these hospitals. And eventually, those staff members were disciplined, and the measures were put in place to ensure that this was not taking place. Another case involved the charging and the exploitation of pregnant women in the hospitals, where they were being charged for things that they were supposed to get for free under a health scheme, a public health scheme in Ghana. And this also led to a series of investigations by various institutions so that the process could be stopped. I mean, it was that serious that in some cases people were literally on their delivery bed and were being taxed to pay or that they were not going to be attended to. And then one very serious case that we uncovered was how second cycle institutions, both public and private, were having these grant schemes to allow candidates to cheat in the West Africa Secondary School Certificate Examination. And this story generated huge public interest, including drawing attention to the issue that the Ghana Education Service was able to sanction the schools, some of the individuals involved in the case. So, and then maybe the last one was one also involving the alleged acts of corruption by a district court. And in essence, this was allegations that were leveled against a registrar of a magistrate's court, who was basically pocketing monies that had been given as awards to litigants. And then somehow with the connivance of the magistrate, was not able to, account for these monies. And eventually he was busted, dismissed from the judicial service, and the magistrates as well was dismissed. Corruption Watch also engaged in other kinds of initiatives. We had an accountability forum, mostly to try to bring the supply side of the anti-corruption fight, state agencies, for us to have a discussion about some of the key issues around delays in the prosecution of cases, in the investigation of cases, but just create a platform for civil society to bring attention to matters that it was observing as also an actor in the process. And then Corruption Watch also instituted Media for Public Integrity Group, which was really trying to mobilize journalists who were working on accountability issues so that they can deepen their understanding on the issues of integrity. You recall that when Don was speaking, he talked about so many different issues, and Adam as well, anti-money laundering. These are all very technical matters that if the media is going to work on, they need to understand and appreciate the nuances and the practices so that they can expose these wrongdoings. Finally, on lessons, putting this together was, always generated a lot of a high risk of a high legal risk because of the threats of defamation, and other kinds of threats that you get. And it required that you had a lot of lawyers to sort of ensure that there were strict protocols and that the legal risk was reduced during the investigation and in the broadcasting. Also, it is always very, very difficult when a corruption allegation has gone cold and there's really no political will to push it. And it requires a lot of media mobilization, to get it back onto the public discussion. But that is what I think is key. And one of the things that Corruption Watch, for me, has succeeded in doing is that even though people get tired of corruption issues because they feel that a lot is not being done, the fact that it's still discussed means that the conscience of the political parties and the political actors are always being pricked on a daily basis, so they don't take it as fait accompli that they can get away with corruption. And then maybe a last part of the lesson, which I think is an important conversation for all of us, is the role of culture. There is a lot of ingrained culture of profiting from public office, and this is a very, very deep issue for African countries. It makes it almost a very determined supply of corruption because people feel a lot of pressure to try to bring something home when they become public officers. And if they are not doing it, they are seen as being either stupid or wicked or people who don't care about their family and their society. So there's a lot of conversation we have to have there about how culture enables corruption. Thank you.
Kodjo, thank you so much for sharing your extensive practitioner's knowledge within the anti-corruption community. I think the insights that you've shared have really rounded off this conversation really well and created a holistic understanding of the topic that at hand today. So now we're going to get into the really exciting part, which is where we will interface with our guests and our speakers. There are some questions in the chat, some really great questions. We might not be able to get all of them, even though we've got half an hour. Some of them have been directed at specific speakers. So I'm going to start off with the first one. Paul Bonoba, this is for you. It was put in the chat by Dr. Sadiq Hure. He says, I'm the director of a community-based organization. My question to Paul Bonoba is, how does Transparency International rank African countries on corruption? And what data do they collect to decide what country ranks and how? Over to you, Paul. Let me know if I should repeat the question, Paul.
Nope, I think I got it. Thank you very much,
Perfect.
Shannon.
Thank you.
And, thank you so much, Dr. Sadiq, for that question as well. And I will be brief on this. It's a very long discussion, but perhaps I can just give you a summary of it. The first is that my understanding of the question is that you're talking about a particular tool, one tool by Transparency International called the Corruption Perceptions Index, which then is the way we put it out in the media, ranks countries on the perception of corruption in the public sector in that country. It is not that different from other tools, but I'll just mention a few features. It's slightly different in this from what we've had today, especially from the Afrobarometer data, in the sense that the questions go to experts. So these are experts responding as opposed to citizens, as we've had from the Afrobarometer's data, and that these experts are responding in different tools. So what Transparency International does is to put together the tools from 13 different institutions using 13 different tools, with experts answering specific questions about corruption in the public sector across the areas where they operate. These will be experts in the Africa teams of international business corporations, They will be in international financial institutions and those kinds of institutions. Some foundations, Bertelsmann's Foundation, there's Afrobarometer, Africa Development Bank data, World Bank, World Economic Forum. So those surveys then bring together this information and putting the perspectives together. One then has a rank and a score in terms of what is the perceived level of corruption in the public sector, very specifically in the public sector, in the countries which are covered by the tool. So that is the tool. Having said that, let me say two things about it. The first is that it is one tool looking at one sector, the public sector. There are quite a number of other tools looking at that same sector, but there are also a number of other tools looking at other sectors. In order to get a sense of corruption in a country, the overall sense of corruption in a country, one would need to use quite a number of data sources, not one singular data source. A number of data sources, what is coming in from the citizens, as we've heard from Afrobarometer, what is coming in from various other tools, citizen report cards, which is not what Afrobarometer is talking about. There will be sector-specific tools. How is corruption in the judiciary in this sector? How is corruption in the, the delivery of public services, water services, land in a particular country? So to get a sense of the totality of how a country is progressing against corruption, that would then also require its own tools, which we're looking at anti-corruption, not corruption, but anti-corruption. How is a country progressing on the scale of fighting against corruption as a problem in that particular country? So my encouragement would be to think of, for anti-corruption actors, a multiple set of tools which provide a lot more data points to look at what is happening at the level of corruption, but also at the level of anti-corruption. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Before we move on to our next question, I'd also just like to direct all of our guests to the Q&A section, the function in your Zoom chat. Thank you so much to our speakers who are already answering questions in there. There's quite a lively chat happening. So as you're listening, please feel free to also hop over there and read some of the answers. The next question I'm going to take is from Paul Hoffman. So Honorable Edem Senanu, this is for you. Paul asks, what is the position of the AU-ABC on the establishment of an international anti-corruption court as advocated by Integrity Initiatives? Is it not among the it is not among the recommendations made yet? Over to you, Honorable Senanu.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. This is effective advocacy to make sure that the issue is on the table. Obviously, the board will not be against any such, kind of arrangement or mechanism. I'm not quite sure we have averted our minds to discussing this. So this is a good opportunity. We will have our 44th ordinary session quite soon. And it will give us an opportunity to pick up some of the issues being raised here. And I'm sure that it definitely will be added to the recommendations. I think that having anti-corruption courts at the national, continental, international level are all some of the strategies that will be key to ensuring that, we have faster rulings on cases, sets the kind of precedents that stops or reduces the impunity that we are seeing in various jurisdictions. So that would be my response. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Senanu. Since we have you on screen already, I think I will take another question from Dr. Sadiq Hure. He says, my second question is to Honorable Edem Senanu. He says, Africa is plagued by rampant corruption. What is one effective way the AU is trying to completely eradicate this menace that is corruption? I see you're already typing your answer for that, so I'm going to hand over to you to give it to us.
Yeah, I stopped because you started the engagement, so I thought I could just speak to it. Well, as we usually say, to talk about completely eradicating is quite difficult. But yes, minimize corruption on the continent. I think that the AUCPCC is the single most important instrument that the AU has developed that stands a good chance of making us make good strides in combating corruption. Not less than 48 countries gives you 87.7 or so. That's almost 90% of countries having ratified this. I think that the challenge is really translating this into laws, policies, strategies, actions, ensuring that governments allocate resources to get implementation. And how we ensure this is done at the member state level is what really matters. And so for me, the most significant initiative by the AU to date has been the convention that we want to review and are reviewing at the moment. But the challenge really is at the operational level. What have we done to ensure that we have translated this into laws, policies, strategies, actions, allocations of budgets, and how civil society can get us to do that much more. I think that then we'll see that the convention comes to life. We can see alignment, and we probably will make greater strides in this fight against corruption. So for now, that is it. I think moving forward, if I just should chip that in, we need to be innovative. As many of us have pointed out, there's been a kind of a lag. We've lost the enthusiasm, the excitement about dealing with corruption seems to have waned. And I think that what it requires is re-strategizing and coming up with innovative ways to bring the change we want to see. And in my mind, one of the key areas will be looking at how do we deal with the behavior change issues. We have cultural norms. Really what we are seeking is to nurture a new kind of culture across Africa. What are the innovative ways? What is research evidence showing us that we can do differently? Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Sinanu. We have a question from Esther, who's a UJ master's student, and I'd like to open this up to either Kojo or Mame. Esther says, I would like to know if there's any hope of reducing corruption in Africa when we have corrupt judges, as mentioned by Mame. If either of you could answer, maybe Kojo, if you could start, and Mame, if you've got any input.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think for me, currently, the biggest challenge we have is that even though civil society is really, and I would add media, I think they've been really at the forefront of trying to keep the corruption issue on the public burner. I think the biggest challenge we have is the weakening of institutions of horizontal accountability that are supposed to check the excesses of the executive. So if your anti-corruption agencies are not working effectively, your audit agencies are not working effectively, your security agencies, even anti-money laundering, the whole sort of gamut of institutions are not working effectively. It puts too much burden on citizens and media who might expose, but then find problems with either investigations or prosecutions, sanctioning, recovery of assets, and so on. So I think that all the measures that we put in place to insulate all these institutions of horizontal accountability from interference and weakening, we have to review them again, because whether it is tenure, whether it is sort of independent funding, somehow there's been all kinds of ways in which that all that protection has been weakened. So we have to almost like look at the systems again and be able to come up with new ways of securing that protection for these institutions, because I don't think that civil society and media alone can be able to fight corruption. If these institutions have to work, otherwise we don't have a chance.
Thank you, Kojo. I think it's been discussed already, but Caleb has a question in the chat, and he has asked, what are the latest strategies, tools, and innovations being implemented to minimize corruption? So we've had some kind of discussion around what these innovations look like. I'd like to open it up to the panel to see if there's anything that we may have missed or anything that you'd like to contribute to this conversation.
So Sharon.
Kojo?
Yes. Were you talking about the innovations, right?
Yes. So Caleb, what we've discussed already is come out in the conversation quite organically. But Caleb has asked what innovation strategies or tools are they being implemented currently to minimize corruption. So if there's anything that we haven't covered from any of our panelists, now's your time to share that with us, please. Paul, Don.
Just a quick.
Yes, Kojo,
just
please.
to say that I think one of the big conversations is around the deployment of technology. So, governments are all looking at, in terms of service delivery, if they can reduce the human, role of, in the processes of delivering whether passports and, water service, whatever. But I think what has been shown is that if at the end, whoever you put in charge of actually deploying that technology, if they don't have integrity, are going to compromise the system. So I think, again, technology is important, but it's just a tool. We still have to work on the human beings. And I think that is, for me, the crux of the matter.
Thank you, Kojo. Don, I'm going to hand over to you.
Yes, thank you again, Shannon. I think there's something that it's not that we didn't do it, but perhaps it didn't receive sufficient emphasis, is to bring out the element of corruption driven by the private sector, the African private sector, foreign investors, and so on. If one might recall the report of His Excellency President Thabo Mbeki and his team, the high-level panel on illicit financial flows from Africa, of 2015, when it looked at the totality of the resources that Africa loses all the time, found that the kind of bribery, the kind of corruption that we've talked about a lot today is actually just 5% of the resources that Africa loses. Then 30% is lost to crimes such as traffickings and launderings in drugs, in persons, in wildlife products, and so on. And that 65% of the resources that Africa loses is actually commerce-based losses, tax evasion, aggressive tax avoidance, transfer mispricing, and so on. So we just have to be careful that we do not invest 95% of our advocacy time fighting 5% of the problem, and then spend only 5% of our advocacy resources, on what should be 95% of the problem. So I think that should be brought out. And when we are expanding our lenses at what else we can do to reduce corruption on the continent so that there's domestic resource mobilization to provide the public goods and services that people want, we should bear that in mind, that we're losing a lot to the private sector, and that should also be addressed. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Don. Okay, next question, also from Dr. Sadiq Hure. This is directed at Honorable Senanu and Paul Banoba. Sadiq Hure says, are you aware that INGOs that operate in Africa engage in rampant corruption by embezzling lots of resources, including official development assistance or humanitarian support resources that would otherwise be used to end hunger and poverty? What is AUABC doing about these corrupt INGOs who also cahoot with local NGOs? And the same question to Mr. Banoba, what is Transparency International doing to stop this widespread corruption? So, Honorable Senanu, I'm going to hand over to you first, and then Paul, if you can come in after that, please.
Well, thank you very much. I think that in general, we have a mandate to oversee the execution of the convention, and it enjoins us to engage member states CSOs, media, and other groupings to get this task done. And to that extent, obviously, when it comes to our notice that there are particular groupings or NGOs and we can speak about it, we'll do just that. I don't think it's something that we've spoken about as a widespread issue. Perhaps one of the recent things we've done is to establish the African Anti-Corruption Research Network, perhaps collecting some more data on what is going on in that space so that one can speak to it much more coherently. And therefore, it's not just speculative, it's not just generic, but then can proffer solutions would be the way to go. So thank you for raising this. It's something that we probably will pick up under the recently launched African Anti-Corruption Research Network, try and collect some data and see how we can more, intelligently speak to the issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Sinanu. I think we can hand over to Paul now.
Thank you so much, Shannon. I think I will only add to what Honorable Sinanu has mentioned, and maybe also link back to what Dawn has mentioned as one observation, and then just one other small observation. So with regard to the addition, it's around data. So the anti-corruption community, especially the state, we would encourage the state, and we do this all the time, to focus on the aspects that are heaviest. So if, as Dawn mentioned, we have data that says 65% of our loss is really, we are bleeding through this particular vehicle, through this particular avenue, there is merit in focusing where the burden is greatest. And maybe that's something that we have not done enough of, but it's something that is rational to do, that this is where the problem is, this is what the data says. And in that respect, also looking at the Afrobarometer data that our colleagues have just presented, and also like in the recent survey, but also mentioned aspects of the methodology, the findings. The data speaks to sectors and institutions that are perceived, or the citizens observe are most affected. And police comes out, and judiciary and other institutions. So the question would be, where do the NGOs lie? NGOs are now included, but what is the rate? To which extent can we say this is now a big problem that requires heavy attention and requires attention before another area? So that's something to do with data. I mean, if there is data out there that says there's a new problem, or a problem that is growing at a fast rate and requires a lot of attention, part of what we don't have is that data coming forth, and so that we can advocate that it's given attention. And that said, I wouldn't disregard that there is no problem in the INGOs, especially in the humanitarian sector. In fact, I would add that that is very, very hurting corruption, because this is there's a section of society that has not been serviced by the state and is now being serviced by these aid measures. And if there's corruption in humanitarian aid, then that particular community is at the worst, most vulnerable possible, because that is the last shot that was helping that community. So it would be immensely affected. And there have been scandals across some of our communities. And we saw this during COVID, the COVID response in the early sections of COVID. We've seen a lot of that. So there is a problem in this area. The questions will be, how much data do we have to point to where the problem is? What is the scale of that problem? Who are the affected in institutions, and who are the perpetrators, and how do we go after that? So that's the one thing. But specifically talking about INGOs or NGOs broadly, the one thing I would encourage us to remember is that in addressing corruption, we do have the prevention side of it, And then if something slips through and all prevention measures have failed and the corruption manifests itself, then there is the combating side of it, combating the corruption. And several times we look at combating corruption because it's the visible, it's the media will pick that up. The media will hardly pick up a prevention workshop somewhere, and Palu is developing codes of conduct that does not attract media attention. So there is a lot of work to be done for visitors to a country, like an INGO that is not domiciled in a country is coming in. There's regulators who will have to look at that. There is people who look at the operations, registration. All those measures would have to fail for corruption to seep through an INGO. So there are a number of other areas we can look at. But broadly speaking, the data has to come out and point to that problem, and then the actors need to swing in to look at what has failed. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul. The Q&A has gained so much momentum, and unfortunately we're running out of time. So I'm going to take 3 more questions, and then I'm going to hand over to our panelists for their last remarks. I want to apologize upfront for my lack of proficiency in French, but we have a question from Professor St. Augustine Muendambali. Kojo, maybe you can answer this. He says, how do we put in place a common anti-corruption policy that would take into account African realities?
Yeah, I think it's a very important. I mean, looking at the AU Anti-Corruption Convention, there are provisions that are still not present in a lot of the legal frameworks on the continent, particularly around illicit enrichment, for instance, which is probably an easier way to prevent corruption, because there's a lot of people who are showing all kinds of wealth that they cannot account for it, but the process for triggering an investigation is not there within the laws. So we need to, I think the 20 years of the convention, if we do a review, has to be one of the areas that we look at more closely to see if those who have ratified are implementing those processes. But also, I really want to emphasize this cultural component of corruption, because I mean, if you ask many public servants or elites in African countries, when you get a government job, you're expected to provide employment for your family members, for all kinds of people. There's a lot of pressure on you to sort of extend the largesse of the state to your family members, and so you would basically turn that into some sort of a private asset, and that is something that we have to tackle, because once the incentives and the motivations are there, and is that pervasive, then it's going to be very, very difficult to stop people from actually engaging in corruption. And when they do engage in it, because everybody is doing it, it is very difficult for them to sanction anybody. If you look at the list of the Afrobarometer's list of trust or people who are corrupt, these are all the people who we have tasked to actually prevent corruption and sanction corruption. So how do you then tackle this in a serious way? So we really need to look at that cultural component, whether it's education, whether it's a real serious conversation about what the value, the set of values should be, and how we can enforce those values. I think that is very, very important.
Thank you, Kojo. I've just been notified that we have some hands up from our participants. Can I please ask that you pop all of your questions into the Q&A section? If we're unable to answer them live, our panelists will definitely be able to type out answers to your most pressing questions. We're going to go on to our last 2 questions. This one is from Dr. Willard T. Mugadza. And Honorable Senanu, I think this one's for you. He says, with the AFC FTA coming into full swing, what special anti-corruption mechanisms can be put in place in order to deal with AFC FTA corruption matters? What can the AU ABC do? And we have a hand up.
C'est ça la politique commune.
So we're going to hand over to Honorable Senanu.
Sorry,
Prof. Augustine, if you can please mute. Apologies.
Apologies.
Je peux parler?
Prof. Augustine, if you can please mute, and we'll answer this question. Thank you. Okay, so the question is, Honorable Senanu, with the AFC FTA coming into full swing, what special anti-corruption mechanisms can be put in place in order to deal with AFC FTA corruption matters? What can the AU-ABC do? Can you hear me, Honorable Senanu?
Yes, I can. Yes,
excellent.
I can hear
Thank you.
Yes. I believe it's still at the member state level. And certainly if we are discovering new ways relating to trade that we want to consider, those are some of the new things that we need to take on board when we are doing legislation. And so, yes, discussions around the continental trade framework and what new things we ought to take on board, maybe some of the areas where one can highlight as we go forward in the next 5-10 years as areas to focus on at the member state level in ensuring that the legal frameworks can combat any new things that may seek to deprive countries of their resources. So yes, it's an important issue that has been raised, and it's a discussion that we can have and then act on, especially to the extent of advising, because one of our roles is advising member states on new and emerging areas and what they can do about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Senanu. I'm going to give the floor to Prof. Augustine now. Thank you, Prof.
Est-ce que la RDC peut prendre la parole?
Please go ahead, Prof.
J'aimerais savoir si la RDC peut prendre la parole.
Yes, please go ahead, Prof. Please go ahead, Prof. You have the floor.
Je peux parler?
Yes, you may speak. You've got the floor.
J'ai la parole. Merci beaucoup. Mes très chaleureuses félicitations à l'équipe du Conseil consultatif de l'Union africaine. Je vous remercie du fond de mon cœur parce que ça fait longtemps que de pareilles opportunités nous ont manqué. Je vous remercie et vous demande de présenter nos sincères félicitations à tous les membres chargés de lutter contre la corruption en Afrique, parce que au moins nous avons pensé à fêter nos 20 ans d'anniversaire du Conseil de la Convention de l'Union africaine pour la prévention et la lutte contre la corruption. Je viens de rentrer de Vienne, où nous avons participé aux préparatifs du 20e anniversaire de la Convention des Nations Unies contre la corruption. Ce geste que vous venez de poser m'a beaucoup marqué et je vous félicite, en particulier Madame Ndiaye, la présidente, avec qui on a toujours entretenu de bonnes relations en matière de lutte contre la corruption. Ma question est la suivante. Le Conseil consultatif doit être considéré comme un laboratoire de l'Union africaine pour permettre de régler des questions de corruption sur le continent. Ce rôle, le Conseil consultatif ne l'a pas du tout joué depuis sa création. Votre présence en ce lieu maintenant, quand je vois des experts du comité qui a été mis en place intervenir, je les vois intervenir, je suis très ravi. Et je crois que c'est aujourd'hui que commence le point de départ. Mais ce point de départ oblige à ce que les experts du conseil consultatif puisse réfléchir sur la mise en place d'une politique commune de lutte contre la corruption. Les expériences sont diverses, mais elles se recoupent quelque part. Est-ce qu'on peut dégager une ligne de conduite qui puisse être appliquée d'une manière générale au continent africain, essayons de combattre chacun dans son coin. Voilà les rôles qui reviennent au Conseil consultatif. Et pour remplir ces rôles, le Conseil consultatif devra se doter d'une plénière. La plénière sera composée de différents chefs d'agence de lutte contre la corruption en Afrique qui vont discuter de leur échange d'expérience comme une espèce de forum qu'on peut programmer une fois tous les 3 mois, 6 mois, de manière à ce que le Conseil consultatif ait des arguments à présenter auprès de la Commission de l'Union africaine quand il s'agit des questions relatives à la lutte contre la corruption. Les sommets des chefs d'État de lutte contre la corruption, sous notre initiative inaugurée à Bujumbura, avait eu lieu en Mauritanie. 5 ans après, on n'a pas fait l'évaluation des résultats, des résolutions de ce premier sommet. Est-ce qu'il ne serait pas temps de penser à intéresser encore nos chefs d'État pour voir quel a été le parcours qu'on a réalisé après les rencontres? Vous feriez œuvre utile. Félicitations à vous tous. Voilà la préoccupation que j'avais et je tiens absolument à être à Arusha pour pouvoir en discuter de vive voix. Merci beaucoup, Madame Chairwoman, pour la prestation élégante. RDC.
Thank you so much for that insightful feedback. I'm just checking if we have
Le
any
Bénin demande la parole
panel.
depuis, nous n'avons pas la parole depuis, le Bénin demande la parole depuis,
Yes,
s'il
I'm
vous plaît.
going to, perfect. We'll hand over to Elias and then directly after that, I think we had Prince's hand up as well. So Benin, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup. Je me présente, je suis Dr Jean-Baptiste Elias, ancien président du Conseil consultatif de l'Union africaine sur la prévention et la lutte contre la corruption et président au Bénin du Front des organisations nationales contre la corruption. Je ne vais pas beaucoup tarder. J'ai apprécié toutes les communications qui ont été faites et comme l'a dit Paul, avec qui nous avons travaillé pendant longtemps, le volet prévention, éducation, sensibilisation manque beaucoup dans nos pays parce que la corruption, c'est le fait des hommes. Et quand on n'aura pas bien fait le travail de sensibilisation et de conscientisation des hommes, même si le volet répression est au rendez-vous, nous aurons toujours des difficultés. Et c'est en cela que nous, au Bénin, nous avons fait une étude dans les localités concernant notre pays et on s'est rendu compte que plus de 40% des populations qui sont dans le domaine et qui doivent effectivement travailler pour que la corruption puisse diminuer sensiblement ne sont pas au courant du contenu ni de la Convention de l'Union africaine sur la prévention et la lutte contre la corruption, ni contre le contenu, ni sur le contenu de la Convention des Nations Unies contre la corruption. Et nous, au FONAC, nous avons initié un projet pour sensibiliser et former les cadres à tous les niveaux. Au moins 8000 personnes seront formées sur le contenu de la Convention de l'Union africaine sur la prévention et la lutte contre la corruption pour que chacun sache ce à quoi il s'en tient quand il s'adonne à la corruption parce que le volet répressif est au rendez-vous au Bénin. J'ai écrit depuis 2 mois à Aga, à Addis Abeba, pensant que Aga pouvait nous accompagner. Et je profite de l'occasion pour dire tous ceux qui sont actuellement en ligne et qui nous écoutent peuvent se servir de ça pour faire la même chose dans leur pays afin que la prévention l'éducation, la sensibilisation puissent être au rendez-vous dans nos pays. Si vous connaissez des partenaires qui sont prêts à nous accompagner au Bénin pour réaliser cette activité, afin qu'au rendez-vous d'ici 2 ans, nous puissions quand même faire le point de la situation, ce serait une très bonne chose. Je félicite à nouveau les membres du Conseil consultatif de l'Union africaine qui ont organisé cette réunion et je dis bravo à tout le monde. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much, Elias. We're going to hand over to Prince next, and then we're going to go back to our panelists for closing remarks. And panelists, if there is anything that these last few participants have kind of brought up that you'd like to address, please do so in your closing remarks. Prince, the floor is yours. I think we may have lost Prince. Okay, so I'm going to head over to our closing remarks, and I'm going to start off with Mame.
Thanks, Shannon. For me, I'd just like to share that from the findings that I shared with everybody, you see that majorities of Africans say that corruption increased in their country during the previous year. We see that majorities say that they are not happy with how their governments are fighting corruption. And again, we see that majorities say that they risk retaliation should they even have the courage to speak up against corruption. And so these were striking for me. And what they tell me is that African governments urgently need to prioritize anti-corruption efforts and most importantly, regain public trust. And I think that is really important, and our other panelists have spoken to this, that we establish a robust mechanism for citizen engagement. Corruption cannot be fought in silos. So I think it's really important that we have mechanisms where active citizens can participate in fighting this graft. But if you also see from the finding that 71% of Africans say they risk retaliation, then I think it's very important that there are also mechanisms that protects whistleblowers, people who are willing to share information to help us fight corruption, and also important that we build accountable institutions that actively work towards eradicating corruption. And last but not the least, I think it's also important we learn from each other in terms of best practices. If you look at the findings that we shared, when you look at countries like Benin and Tanzania, you can see that they rate their governments very high in fighting corruption. Now we need to ask ourselves, what is it that the government is doing for the citizens to rate them this high? And then when you look at countries like Sudan, Gabon, and Eswatini, you see that the ratings are really low. So what can these countries then learn from the other countries where the fight against corruption seems to be doing well? I think it's important that we collaborate and then learn best practices so that together we can hopefully kill corruption from the continent. Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you, Mame. Don, if I can hand over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Shannon. I just want to end with a saying from France, the venerable Frantz Fanon, that each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission and either fulfill it or betray it. We're not underrating the challenges that we have on the continent, but this is our generation. We define our mission, we fulfill it or betray it. So I don't think that there's any part of this fight that we should not engage in. I don't think that we should, give up if we discover, for instance, as one of the audience asked, that if the judges are corrupt, then how can we fight corruption? I think it's just to roll up our sleeves, work together, build stronger coalitions and social movements, and just get the work done. That will be my final word. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Honorable Senano, if we can head over to you.
Thank you. A few things I would like to comment on. I think my first reflection is really the issue of culture. When I look at the data from Transparency International and other countries that seem to be making gains here, the number one thing that stands out for me is that they nurtured a culture of anti-corruption and good governance. How we can intelligently mainstream and integrate this kind of culture, starting from our young ones, content in the educational system, what is dealt with in families, etc., so that we begin to generate, cultivate, nurture a generation that take these matters a lot more seriously from a behavior point of view. I think it's important. I think the root is our value systems and how they clash with this idea of corruption and what we think are cultural norms. And we need to start tackling it from that kind of behavior change understanding. Next thing I'd like to speak to is the issue of education. How are we packaging information innovatively? Are we doing it so that the rank and file, the grassroots, the people who are not in the mainstream and speaking in English can understand the issues and begin to decide for themselves the small incremental actions they can take? I think looking at the big picture, we get overwhelmed. What are the small things we can do? How can we get ordinary citizens across the length and breadth of this continent to find space to do something in their spheres of influence to move this fight forward? Education, education, education. How do we package the content with messages that can actually impact people? Strong institutions and their independence is something that we need to fight for. If we're in civil society, we need strong institutions. They need to be independent. They need to have their own resources. That's a key thing in getting this fight done. And finally, I'd like to talk about participation. In my work and research over the last 5 years, I think that our governance architecture in many African countries has a deficit in terms of permanent, regular platforms for citizens who are professionals in different spaces to continuously engage the political system, the various branches of government, and to have their ideas feed into what is going on and to hold accountable. If we're doing the democratic platforms right, we should find a situation where at all levels of government, you have professionals from civil society, from private sector, regularly engaging, asking the questions and holding governments accountable. I think that expanding participation is one of the things we need to be looking at in the next 20 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Senano. We're going to hand over to Paul Aborampa Mensah from Data for Governance Alliance, and then directly after that, we'll go to Paul Banoba from Transparency International for their closing remarks. And then we will close with Koja Asante. Thank you so much, Paul. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sharon. And the data presented and all the comments reveal the fact that we still have a long way to go in our efforts to try and reduce corruption in Africa. And we hope a big lot of the tax depends on how the citizens and civil society organizations to come together to ensure that we have a corrupt-free Africa so that the little amounts left for us could be used for better development. So we urge all civil society organizations to be part of the revolution, be part of the effort so that we are able to engage better. Those doing tracking work should be serious about the tracking project they are doing. Those doing advocacy should intensify and back the advocacy with data so that we are able to pinpoint particular interventions needed to be able to reduce the corrupt practices. Thank you.
Shannon, should I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shannon. And I think I'll just make one observation that corruption, as we all know, by its very nature, permeates all levels of our society. And therefore, in terms of responding to corruption, calls on all levels of our society, different communities to come together. And for that matter, I wish to make the observation here that the spirit in which we are coming together today and that is the spirit of Article 22 5G of the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption, calling upon the coordinating entity, the African Union Advisory Board Against Corruption, to bring together multiple communities in the engaging against corruption. That's the spirit in which we sit today. And that is a great spirit. It reflects that we've come a long way. It reflects that the spaces, as we know them, those of us who work in fairly complex spaces, the spaces this time around exist, and those spaces are expanding. And it calls upon us to occupy those spaces. And my particular observation is to equip ourselves, build a capacity for more actors to join those spaces, and particularly fill them with data, more data against corruption. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Kojo, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. I think the first, for me, message is really, I think, around gathering data. And we have discovered that, we need to employ, all kinds of tactics to really get to sometimes very complex transactions. Sometimes, of course, things that are done behind closed doors using undercover, journalists and so on to get to that data. But we need that data. We, for example, have been gathering data on the kind of monies that are being spent to finance campaigns and so on, to really, when we are going to do campaign financing reform, to really be informed by the practice of it, so that we can be more successful in trying to regulate campaign financing. So I think for me, we should mine as much of the data that's available and utilize it. The AU board, can draw from those kinds of analysis and insights to also advise, the African Union. And related to that, I think campaign financing reform is a major issue that we have to focus on if we are ever going to deal with corruption. That is the root cause of corruption. And we need to find ways to kind of demonetize elections as they currently are. And then lastly, I think whether it is petty corruption or it is, grand corruption, the issue about regulating discretion, the exercise of discretion within the states and political officers and so on, is one area that we have to look at, because I agree that there are areas around illicit transfers and so on, but it still comes down to one person having to make a decision one way or the other, whether or not, somebody should get a sweetheart deal or, benefit from a kickback. So we need to tighten those kinds of systems, and we can deal with both grand and petty corruption. But thanks again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Kojo. I am aware that we are running a little bit over time. I promise we're going to be wrapping up soon. I would like to hand over now to Inga Pop from Laws Africa to give our vote of thanks.
Thank you so much. Yes, hello everyone. I'm Inga Pop. I'm here on behalf of Laws.Africa, and I wish to extend our sincere thanks to all of our honorable panelists for the very valuable and informative presentations that you've given us today. As always, we're grateful to our partners in the Data for Governance Alliance for organizing this webinar, to the AUABC for its contribution to making it a success, to Shannon for coordinating the discussion so smoothly and keeping us all engaged, and to John and Najit, our hardworking translators, for making the webinar available en français. And finally, I wish to also extend thanks to everyone who's attended for your time and your attention. Our panelists have highlighted the fact that civil society plays a critical role in anti-corruption efforts in the AU in various different ways, whether it's investigation, reporting, advocacy, strategic litigation, and so on. And knowing this, as Laws.Africa, we've developed our site, africanlead.org, to be a comprehensive and authoritative repository of legal and policy resources from across the AU. So we developed the site and curated resources with civil society and their needs in mind. Our mission and our hope is that the African League collection will be widely used and relied upon by CSOs, researchers, AU organs, anyone in Africa who's working towards achieving the kind of good governance and transparent governance that all Africans deserve. Because as they say, knowledge is power. We hope it will serve as a powerful tool for holding those who engage in corruption accountable. I'm going to take the opportunity to ask you please to visit the site. Again, that is africanli.org, AFRICANLII.org, and make use of our resources. Everything is free and open access. And get in touch with us if you have any feedback or any questions. And with that, once again, thank you to everyone who's present here, and I wish you all a very pleasant day further.
Thank you, Inga. Some last comments from my side. If you enjoyed this webinar, there are some upcoming events on the Data for Governance Alliance calendar. There's a webinar with the African Committee of Experts on Rights and the Welfare of the Child, as well as the launch of our Advocacy Manual and Agenda 2063 scorecard and our regional convenings on democracy and human rights. So please keep an eye out on the Data for Governance website and social media channels for information surrounding those events. And Afrobarometer will be hosting a webinar on youth in August in line with International Youth Day. They again, keep an eye out on Afrobarometer's website and social media channels. Once again, thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at our upcoming events. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you,
Bye.
and goodbye.
And everyone.
Thank you.